Hello and welcome to Status Hour. I'm Noura Erakat. In March 2021, the Palestinian Feminist Collective issued a pledge affirming that Palestine is a feminist issue. The pledge offers a feminist critique of Zionist settler colonialism and reads in part, Zionist violence continues to dominate Palestinian lives in intimate ways. Throughout the homeland, Israel demolishes Palestinian homes, subjects Palestinian prisoners of conscience to systematic sexual and physical abuse and torture, and polices Palestinian bodies, sexualities, reproductive life, and family life. The pledge emerges in a context of renewals of Palestinian feminist organizing in Palestine and throughout its diaspora. In particular, it responds to institutional attempts to exclude Palestinian feminists from organizing spaces like the Women's March, as well as other attempts to mobilize orientalist tropes about Muslims and Arabs in order to absolve Zionist violence, most notably, but not exclusively, in the case of pinkwashing. The legacies of Palestinian feminist organizing and knowledge production, transnational solidarity, and grassroots organizing extend back decades. For example, at the first ever World Conference of the International Women's Year convened in Mexico City in 1975, a coalition of Palestinian feminists successfully mobilized the group of 133 states and 7 national liberation movements to condemn Zionism alongside racism, colonialism, and apartheid 4 times in the final text of the conference report. The international meeting also pledged to support Palestinian and Arab women by providing moral and material assistance to them to achieve the right of return and self-determination. The International Women's Convening would be the first to condemn Zionism in a series of conferences throughout the summer of 1975, including the Organization of African Unity, as well as the non-aligned movement, leading up to the successful effort at the United Nations to endorse Resolution 3379, finding Zionism to be a form of racism and racial discrimination. The legacy of Palestinian feminists continues today, not only in the Palestinian Feminist Collective-led pledge, but also in ongoing intersectional activism that has placed Palestine squarely within a progressive agenda, particularly in North America. Here to discuss that history with Status Hour is Professor Nada Elia, a professor at Western Washington University, where she teaches Arab American Studies and Comparative Cultural Studies. Nada is a regular contributor to Mondoweiss and Middle East Eye, where she publishes editorials about Palestine, gender, activism, and transnational struggles. She is the author of Trances, Dances, and Vociferations, Agency and Resistance in Africana Women's Narratives, and is currently completing a second book, Greater Than the Sum of Our Parts, Feminism, Internationalism, and Palestine. She has co-edited the Critical Ethnic Studies of Reader, as well as the award-winning The Revolution Will Not Be Funded, and has contributed to chapters to numerous anthologies, including, most recently, Palestine, A Socialist Introduction. Welcome to Status Hour, Nada.
Thank you. Thanks for having me here. It's good to be here. And I do want to start out by saying I really appreciate the historical context that you're bringing in, the legacies. I know that you're interviewing me about Palestinian feminism, but I mean, I want to do justice and I want to uplift all of the Palestinian feminist sisters and the legacies that I am the product of. So you're interviewing me, but I'm going to be speaking about the collective work that we have done.
Absolutely. And even the way that you're framing that is a feminist practice in and of itself, right? To both contextualize yourself, to acknowledge and place yourself within a context, which is what we're learning from, right? I too am part of that legacy and part of a generation that watched you create a space for me. And now I'm trying to do the same. So why don't we start there? Why don't you tell us about how you come into feminism and how you define that and more generally, how you identify as a feminist?
It started, I mean, I could say, of course, like so many of us, I was a feminist before I even knew the term for it. You know, I personally, my father died when I was 7 and I have only sisters and I grew up surrounded by this pity that everyone had of the family, because I kept hearing all around us, kullun banat, they're all girls, because I have no brothers. So my father died, there was my mother and my sisters and I, and we were all girls, and that's all I ever heard. Kullun banat, as if it were like the tragedy of my father's death was greater because he did not leave behind a boy, a son. It's like we were deficient. And so, and I'm like, I did not enjoy growing up with this idea that I was going to be forever deficient because we're all girls, right? So, so I grew up with that idea of like, what's wrong with us for being girls? And then I grew up in Beirut, Palestinian in Beirut, and then the war started. And during the war, I naturally gravitated towards activism. And I was in many activist spaces opposing so many of the ills of Lebanese society, sectarianism, fragmentation, and all of that. And I saw that within these activist spaces, some of the same social expectations that we were fighting against were being duplicated. So it was like something was wrong, we weren't kullun banat, we weren't all girls in those spaces, but within these spaces we were duplicating that same sense of like of what of the social things we were fighting against. I mean, like some very, very, very minor examples. I was in one activist space, and there was, we were in the streets, we were protesting and all of that. And there was a foreign journalist who spoke English, and they asked for someone who spoke English, and I was there. And so I was the person who was speaking. And, this was Beirut during the war and the 70s. And I was smoking, I was wearing an oversized dirty shirt or something. And I gave what I thought was a good interview. And at the end of it, my male fellow activists told me that I did a good job, but next time would I please not have a cigarette, and could I dress up better, because maybe I could become the regular person who would be giving interviews. And I'm like, I mean, what kind of revolution expects us to be ladylike, right? I mean, like, we're in a revolution. We have to be ladylike. It's like the whole, I was very, very young, and it's like I constantly grew up with these social expectations that constrained me, that made me feel deficient. So this is just my personal experience. I know many of us have had similar moments where it's like, wait a minute, what are we fighting if it doesn't liberate us from all of these social expectations, from all of these norms that are oppressive, that make us lesser, and so on. So then I came to the US, and I was not in Lebanon. I had not heard the term feminist. I came to the US, I heard the term feminist, and I had that initial pullback that many people hearing the word feminism for the first time experience, like, I'm not a feminist, because all of these negative associations of feminism. It's like, but I am a feminist. I mean, clearly what feminism stands for, I fully embrace. So with that very initial moment of like, do I call myself a feminist or not? It didn't take long. Yes, I called myself a feminist, and I've been a feminist since, and working in feminist spaces and defining feminism and shaping feminism, because there are so many feminisms. And of course, my feminism, the Palestinian feminist, Palestinian praxis and understanding is obviously one form, and but it's a space where we can grow and liberate ourselves and liberate society.
Thank you. So let's move into some of this analysis, right? And you talked about the legacies that precede us. And so a critical part of it, in 2001, Nadine and Nabir Iman Dasu'i, and Lina Barudi in an effort to draft a report called The Forgottenism, which laid out a feminist anti-Zionist analysis to be presented at the 2001 World Conference Against Racism in Durban, South Africa, also known as the Durban Review. And for full transparency, I was an enthusiastic undergraduate researcher that was, formatting the footnotes and finding the sources for this report, and had no idea at the time of exactly how revolutionary, so to speak, it was and remains. In many ways, this effort continued the legacy of Arab and Palestinian feminist efforts, like the ones in Mexico in 1975. Can you share some of the key elements of the feminist critique of Zionism laid out in the document and tell us what happened in Durban that year as well?
Sure. And for full transparency, you were one of the researchers. I'm one of the women interviewed in that. And of course, my name doesn't appear because I think a few of the participants in the surveys wanted their name changed. And so the decision was to change everyone's name. So that's why there's no Nada in that forgottenism, in that very, very, very important essay, but I was one of the people interviewed in it. And I think that essay is absolutely groundbreaking and really important. And, you said I teach Arab American studies and comparative cultural studies, and I assign that essay a lot. And it's just like, I am so very thankful to everyone who worked on it. The points it made then are still really important. So of course, the forgottenism is about how when we name various systems of oppression, the Zionism as a system of oppression is not necessarily named, identified, and it is important because for so many of us, it is our primary oppressor. And it talks about basically the hegemony of Zionist views in mainstream American progressive, I wouldn't say progressive, liberal or feminist communities, where as soon as we actually identify our oppressor as Zionism, we are censored, we are silenced, we are smeared as anti-Semitic. And if I recall correctly, the immediate impetus for that essay was the Second Intifada. And during the Second Intifada, Palestinian Americans were invited to talk about what was going on in Palestine and what is this about. And the minute we named Israel as our oppressor, we encountered all of this hostility. So this was happening in liberal circles, in progressive circles, and we couldn't speak about it. So that's one of the main things, the main points of that essay, which was going to be presented at Durban in 2001. Of course, the timing of that conference, which couldn't be controlled, was like a whole nother story. But anyway, so the findings of that is that basically we are silenced within liberal circles, within feminist circles, within progressive circles. Zionism is impacting us as women. Zionism is impacting us as activists, and also very importantly, that essay already names the fact that we are not just victims, but active organizers with a critical analysis of systems and structures of oppression. So it's like there's so much talk about how, and I'm really glad that, Palestinian feminist activism is now being welcomed and embraced and adopted in so many of the progressive communities now. But even in 2001, which is 21 years ago,
Wow.
there was already yeah, you were very young. There was already well, no, we are already in the footsteps of women who are not victims as much as they are organizers. We have a long lineage. So as you said, this was supposed to be presented at the Durban conference in 2001. This was the World Conference on Racism, and it was in South Africa. So, there were a lot of Palestinian solidarity participants there. And many actually named Zionism as a form of racism. It was something that was, for many people, not a controversial thing. It's like, of course, we recognize racism. We recognize ethno-nationalist supremacy. We recognize, South Africa knew that, so many third world countries, global South countries were aware of that. And it wasn't something that most of these participants debated. Zionism hinges on ethno-nationalist supremacy. Therefore, Zionism is one of the forms of discrimination, of racism. And there was a draft statement that was supposed to be issued at the end of that conference. The draft had been prepared, and the draft did name Zionism as one of the unacceptable forms of racism, but of course, the US and Israel had seen the draft because, it was a draft in preparation, and they objected to it, and they withdrew from the conference. And when the US and Israel withdrew from the conference, enough of the participants were pressured into actually taking out the part in the draft that references Zionism as a form of racism. So the declaration didn't have that. Ultimately, all of this, and it was a huge fragmentation, pressure, extreme pressure from the highest levels of the US, as in this declaration cannot be issued, and the whole conference kind of like fragmented and collapsed. But all of this fizzled out because, as I said, the actual time of the conference was, it ended on September 8th, 2001, and then the very next day was 9/11. So all of this fizzled out because 9/11 was more important than the discussion of Zionism as a form of racism. But what we did see in Durban 2001, as well as the following two Durbans, is basically the power of global Zionist censorship. We speak about it here in the US, but it's actually global because Durban, there were so many people, so many contingents, so many progressive communities who had drafted that statement that was going to name Zionism as a form of racism. And even there, it was shut down, and it was actually taken out of the final draft of the declaration.
So I want to just say two things to jump in here. One is the resonance that this, that what you point out by the US and Israel, pulling out. What Naomi Klein and others have also shown us is that the US was trying to protect itself from the claim that the US owed reparations to its African descendants, right? And especially those slave descendants in the United States, right? So the US was also covering itself to not have to address that issue. And this is an ongoing theme from 1975 to 2001 to the present, which is how, Zionism and protecting it and the attack on Palestinian rights becomes the back door, right, for reactionary forces to basically take down entire left progressive agendas. But under the veneer and the excuse of this is just about Zionism. But what they're in fact doing is taking down, destroying everything else, right?
Thank you for putting that out. It was very self-serving of the US. It wasn't only like, oh, we're protecting Israel. It's like, absolutely, we're protecting ourselves, because if we start naming Zionism and reparations, then we have to look at ourselves too. And the US is not ready. Absolutely not.
Oh, no. And I think it was the following review conference in Geneva around racism, where they turned it all into a passive voice, so that they stopped even naming what the source of racism was and started addressing racism as if it was a natural disaster, right? Like it was a hurricane or a tornado that ripped through societies, but would not name any states, actors, supremacist movements, right? Ideologies. And so, so the other thing I wanted to name, and this is related to the other question I want to ask you, is something that I did with, in my capacity when I worked with Badil, and we submitted a petition under the, Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. And the idea was specifically, how does this convention apply to the Palestinian women who are citizens of Israel? And we were able to demonstrate, right, the lack of maternal health care, the lack of prenatal health care, the lack of medical facilities, the inadequate housing, the lack of electricity and plumbing in unrecognized villages, right? The attacks on children, the imprisonment of children without counsel, the discrimination against Palestinian girls who couldn't access schools because of a lack of, all these things that we can name structurally, which anybody would understand, but we're able to point out this is actually how Zionism is, right? Violence against women. And making that connection is the work that we've been doing, but with a lot of pushback and recalcitrance, which brings me to, this very shallow debate that we often hear that goes something like this. Zionists and their supporters frame their opposition to Palestinian liberation in a patronizing and a benevolent colonial framework of wanting to save Palestinian and queer folk, right? Like this idea of you can't walk in Gaza with your hair out, or let's see you if you're queer go, as if missiles, when they drop from the air, like veer left if they see a woman or somebody queer. But anyway, that they frame our primary culprit and aggressor as savage Palestinian men. Can you comment on the bankruptcy of this argument and describe some of its enduring cachet?
I think I could comment on this for the entire hour, if not for weeks, if not for months. Yes, of course. We have to understand, and many of us understand, and of course there's ample documentation, not just in the case of Israel, but globally, that colonialism is violence, and violence is gendered. All colonialism is violence, and all violence is gendered. So the absurdity of the idea that a colonizer is a liberator should be obvious. A colonizer is not out to liberate anyone. And we see, looking at the US, looking at Turtle Island, the disproportionate rates of violence against indigenous women in the US is proof, not that we need it, but it is proof that settler colonialism is gendered violence. The fact that South Africa today, still reeling from the aftershocks of apartheid, is the most dangerous country in the world for women. This is proof that when you look at settler colonial countries, when you look at colonialism, colonialism is gendered violence. Israel is no exception. You've named just very, very few of these examples, like the denial of Palestinian women's rights, access to all of that. So Israel, I don't know why it would even project itself as trying to save Palestinian women. It doesn't want to save Palestinian women. It wants us dead, period. Israel wants Palestinian women because we're Palestinian, dead. We are the bearers of the demographic threat. We are not spared Israeli violence. At so many levels of Israeli politics, from day one, there's been intentional violence against Palestinian women. For example, we know that Ayelet Shaked, who's now interior minister, but at the time when she made that horrific statement was justice minister, she said that Palestinian women should be killed because we are the bearers of little snakes, right? We produce little snakes. Our Palestinian children are snakes, and therefore we should not be spared. So how then do you reconcile that with Israel trying to save Palestinian women? Israeli military advisors say one deterrent to Hamas attacks is raping the women, the mothers and sisters of Hamas militants. If we threaten to rape the women and mothers, the mothers and sisters of Hamas militants, then the Hamas militants may be deterred. That's one way of this is intentional, structural Israeli violence against Palestinian women. This is not liberation. Palestinian women, as you said, are children, are arrested, interrogated. Dima Alwawi was 12 when she was arrested and interrogated by male soldiers, not a single woman, a soldier, not that they're necessarily nicer, but it is actually, she was supposed to have females interrogating her. She was probably sexually tortured. She bled. She was 12. Rasmiya Aoudeh was raped in prison. Our reproductive rights are politicized, are violated. Women's reproduction is very, very politicized. I mean, we're still reeling here from the SCOTUS decision, but back in the 1950s in Israel, Ben Gurion encouraged Israeli women to have many children. If an Israeli woman had only 4 children, she was shamed, publicly shamed. He gave rewards for Israeli women who had 10 or more children. And when you speak about the hospitals and safe access to reproductive health, back in 1967, as of 1967, basically the occupation of the West Bank, Israel stopped issuing licenses for the dayas. The daya is the traditional Palestinian midwife that many Palestinian mothers, pregnant women, depended on. It stopped issuing licenses, and eventually dayas fizzled out because there's only so many, and no one could become a daya anymore. So the licenses, because they were not giving licenses, and as a result of the unavailability of dayas, Palestinian women became dependent on hospitals. And we know all the problems about being able to reach a hospital with 500 roadblocks and checkpoints within the West Bank. So we're dependent on hospitals, whereas we could have dayas come to our home. And with the dependency on hospitals, there wasn't an upgrade of the hospital facilities. And so pregnancy and childbirth became more dangerous. This is not Israel trying to save Palestinian women, and it is not Palestinian men oppressing Palestinian women, because Palestinian men are not setting up the roadblocks. Palestinian men have not stopped issuing licenses for the dayas. This is Israel doing it, and there's a fabulous article. I mean, Roda Kanani's Birthing the Nation, of course, is an extremely important book about the politicization of birth, birthing the nation. There's also an article by Rita Jakaman, and I wish I could think, this is obviously, I'm just thinking aloud now, where she actually says that the reason that Israel wanted Palestinian women to give birth in hospitals was in order to better keep track of who was being born. That's not liberating us, right? So I mean, we know that women are giving birth at checkpoints. 10% of Palestinian women in the West Bank are detained at the checkpoints to the point where their pregnancy is endangered. They give birth at the checkpoint. The infants newly delivered are dying. They're miscarrying at checkpoints. 10% of women are suffering because of the checkpoints, when we are now needing to go to hospitals for childbirth, whereas we could have depended on the dayas, but Israel stopped issuing licenses for the dayas, and it's illegal to use a daya now. So that's one thing. As I said, I could talk about it for
you could.
Time. So that's women. But as far as queer, again, I mean, it's mind-boggling to me how someone still buys into the pinkwashing campaign that says that Israel is gay-friendly, rather than see within pinkwashing, again, how much Israel is co-opting queer, beyond co-opting queer rights. I mean, this is just totally a propaganda campaign where you can only think Israel is queer-friendly if for you Palestinian queers do not exist. Mm-hmm. Because Israel is not friendly towards Palestinian queers. Israel has never stopped to ask you about your sexuality before bombing you, right? Israel does not say, I mean, the statement by Al-Qaus, there's no pink door in the apartheid wall, I think just summarizes exactly how Israel is not queer friendly when it comes to Palestinian queers. None of our rights are granted us for being queer. If you're Palestinian first and foremost, And queer, if anything, can be used against you. Israel exploits latent homophobia in Palestinian society as it is in all societies. I mean, it's not like, Israel is not homophobic or the US is not homophobic. Homophobia, unfortunately, is everywhere. And Israel exploits that by basically threatening Palestinian queers with outing them to a society that may otherwise hurt them, and blackmails them into becoming collaborators. And if anything, when a Palestinian is found to be a collaborator, then that adds to the idea that queers are unreliable. It's like it's not gay friendly, right? So Israel, for example, yes, it allows, and it allowed openly gay soldiers to serve in the army long before the US dropped Don't Ask, Don't Tell. But, does a gay soldier not drop bombs on a home? I mean, so as far as, you can only think of Israel as a woman-friendly society if you erase the experience of Palestinian women. It is not saving us. It is politicizing our humanity as women. Mm-hmm. And as far as queers, it can all be summarized in that one amazing statement: there is no pink door in the apartheid wall. Even those Palestinians who do go, I mean, there's that movie, Invisible Man, right? It's an Israeli-made movie documentary about how Israelis help gay Palestinians to flee into Tel Aviv, but only as a stepping point before they go into Europe, because even the director of that movie, and I don't remember his name, but the director said, well, we can't have them stay in Israel. That would be a precedent for the right of return. He actually said that when he was asked, like, okay, so what do you do as queer-friendly allies? What do you do? And he goes, well, we allow the queer Palestinians who are fleeing an oppressive society in their community to come into Tel Aviv on their way to Europe. Why don't they stay in Tel Aviv? Because that would be the precedent for the right of return.
I think, and the other thing that this obscures is like the actual homophobia within Israeli society amongst Israelis, like driven by religious, religious extremists, driven by culture, driven by a militarist society. I mean, talk about, that's gendered violence as well, just thinking about the conscription of all women. And yet all those things get obscured in the same way that they get obscured in the United States, even as we have a Supreme Court that wants to now push back against the constitutional right of same-sex couples to marry. Yeah. And, for me, analytically, when I listen to this, it's a very liberal argument of the individual right versus the structural violence. We can't see the structure. So often we can't see the structure, which is obscured, but we can narrate the anecdotes about the individual in a way that sets up this narrative for us. Yeah. And that's the work, that's the work of being able to unearth that. And I think, as you pointed out, it's queer Palestinians and Palestinian women who are doing it for ourselves to out that, right?
Yes.
But that said, we're also fighting multiple fronts, and patriarchy, even amongst the self-identified, men who identify as feminists, is real. And so I just want to get into a little bit about how that was, how the history also of Palestinian women in our movement has been obscured, right? For whatever reason. We don't need to get into the details of how it's obscured, but it has been. And
it has been obscured in all histories, Palestinian women's contributions throughout history, yes.
Indeed. Oh, no. I'm definitely not exceptionalizing Palestinian society, but I also don't want to exceptionalize it, that we don't have these afflictions, and that's why we fight on multiple fronts. So what is this? So one example of this, and you brought this up recently in a mini lecture that I was an audience member of, something that I didn't know, that the founders of the Arab American University graduates, one of the most significant institutions of Arab American organizing, of anti-imperialism, of anti-racism, happen to have been founded by Palestinian women. And yet that's not how the history was narrated. So can you tell me about the role of Palestinian women in the founding of the AAUG?
Yes, absolutely. And here I want to give credit to Evelyn Shakir, her book Bint Arab, which again is one of the books I always teach in my Intro to Arab American Studies, and I highly recommend it. And I mean, I am so grateful to her for writing that book. It's just one of my favorite books ever as far as Arab American history goes, Bint Arab by Evelyn Shakir. And it is in Bint Arab that I first came across this, and then I did some more digging deep into like AAUG and also in Bint Arab, Evelyn Shakir is talking about how Jean Makdisi, Edward Said's sister, Jean Makdisi, in her own right, when she was a student here in the 50s, the 50s, right after the creation of Israel, she was invited to, like so many of us are, or we no longer are, but back in the days, to give a talk on Arab women. And she talked about Arab women and her upbringing and the disruption that the creation of Israel created to her in her family and all of that. And she was talking about that. And at the end of that talk, where she was speaking about Arab women, she was bombarded with questions about why she and Arabs generally hate Jews. And she, just like so many of us, functioned with enough Arab American women around her that she was talking about this experience and found that it was a common experience. You know, we started out with a discussion of the forgotten ism, and the forgotten ism, its immediate impetus was also like women talking among each other. Like, you know, when we go, why are we constantly bombarded with these questions when we're talking about our experiences? So it was a similar thing. And, you know, and Jean Makdisi talked to some of her friends, Elaine Hagopian, other Arab American women, and pro-Palestine, Palestinian women, Arab women, and she was talking about them about this experiences, like, and they all realized that that's something that they had to do, and they founded, yes, alongside Edward Said, alongside Ibrahim Abu Lughad, they founded AAUG. And as I said, you know, it's like, as I'm doing research, it's like, you know, who was the keeper of all the archives, who was doing the research, who was doing all of that? It was primarily these women, and their names are not recorded. It's not known that Makdisi was as instrumental, if not more instrumental, as Edward Said and Ibrahim Abu Lughad. And so we do need to revive that. And I think it's really important because, you know, it is empowering to have role models. It is empowering to know that we're following in the footsteps of women, that the path is there. We just have to keep on moving. Mm-hmm. We're not, yes, we are creating the road as we travel, but we're not, I mean, there are trailblazers behind us and we stand on their shoulders. And the AAUG is an extremely important institution that was co-founded by women. And that's something we need to be aware of.
So let's continue this legacy of this history. Let's get into the history, which you have done us a service of piecing together. Mm-hmm. And so I appreciate you sharing that with us here. We saw in the summer in 2021, and largely in response to the Unity Intifada, dozens of women and gender studies departments issued statements in solidarity with Palestinians in their freedom struggle. No whataboutism, just support Palestinian freedom, which was a major sea change. Mm-hmm. While this may seem like an obvious reaction in this moment, in fact, it reflects decades of organizing efforts, right? Often obscured, some that we know. But can you walk us through some of the most contentious and key moments of that struggle historically, and most recently, how it's manifested yet again as a contentious struggle within the Women's March?
That's a huge question.
Indeed.
That's a huge
Do you want me to narrow it slightly?
I'm trying to think like milestones and key moments, and there are so many of them. I mean, where do we start? Yeah, maybe it would help me if you narrowed it a little, because
So I'm thinking about two key junctures, right?
Okay.
I'm thinking about two key junctures. We've mentioned, there's the 1975, there's the founding of AAUG, there's obviously the 2001, the Forgotten Ism, but
Yeah.
in more contemporary junctures, I'm thinking about the US Social Forum in 2010.
Yes.
And how it was definitely, right? There was a contentious moment where Palestinian women's organizing shifted forever in a progressive space,
Yes.
a position on Zionism that hadn't percolated into the mainstream as it is now. And then the other milestone is obviously in the rise in the organization of the Women's March, as it affected several key Palestinian women leaders, Linda Sarsour, Rasmiya Odeh, Zahra Bilou, and Samia Assad. Right? So that these are another moment where terms are being defined in progressive spaces of whether or not we understand Palestine as a feminist issue and whether or not we understand Palestine as a progressive issue, period.
Absolutely, yes. Thanks for narrowing it down, because otherwise, as we know, there's just
My
so
bad.
much to talk about. So the USSF was in 2010, I believe, and the USSF, the United States Social Forum, is supposed to be an extremely progressive space. When you go to the USSF, you are going to a progressive space. And it was going to be like big and huge and beautiful and progressive. And then only like days before the USSF happened, like when the program was finally published, because, it was, when the program was finally published, some of us looked and our jaw dropped. There was a workshop by Stand With Us, a workshop on queer Palestinians and homosexuality in the Middle East, something like that, homosexual rights or lack thereof in the Middle East, put on by Stand With Us. And Stand With Us is a Zionist propaganda thing, it's organization. Stand With Us is absolutely not Palestinian friendly. It is not queer friendly. It's like Stand With Us, right? So we were horrified when we saw that, and we approached the and I say we, and we were really a very, very large coalition of Arab Americans, Palestinian Americans, both in the diaspora and in the homeland. Everybody came on board and talked to the USSF organizers and said, what is going on? How can you have at the USSF a Stand With Us workshop put on by homophobic Zionists about Palestinian queer rights, right? And we realized, basically what we were told is that the organizers had been so swamped by so many proposals that they simply approved every single one of them without vetting them, because they had assumed that anyone coming to the USSF would be progressive, and they weren't going to back away from it, and all of that. So, but this was a moment when, as I said, so many of us came together globally, literally from 2 continents away, from Palestine to Turtle Island, and we're like, no, we cannot allow this to happen. It's not okay, If we have to shut down the USSF, we will shut down the USSF. This is not okay. And we talked to the organizers, and they did come around, but it was a moment, a major moment of educating progressive organizers around the fact that Zionism has no place, period, in progressive circles. And at first they tried, well, like, okay, so how about we approach the organizers of that Stand With Us panel about having a Palestinian speaker or an Arab speaker, or no, we don't normalize with Stand With Us, absolutely not. But besides, even Stand With Us actually refused that, because some organizers of the USSF actually did approach the Stand With Us workshop facilitator and said, would you accept a Palestinian?
Oh, I didn't know this detail.
Yeah, and Stand With Us said no. They refused to have a Palestinian co-facilitator.
Yeah, that's
because it's Stand With Us, right? They refused, but so they had approached them, and then we said no. Even if they were to say yes, we want that workshop shut down. And eventually it was shut down. But basically, what comes out of that is that we had to educate otherwise extremely progressive organizers about the fact that no aspect of Zionism is allowed in progressive spaces, because Zionism, there is nothing about Zionism that is progressive.
And in this case, it was, it masquerading again as a liberationist movement. I mean, it was that trope that we would just spend some time dismantling. Yeah.
I mean, it was supposed to be a queer-friendly thing, right? But anyway, so that's one of those very key moments. The other one, of course, the Women's March. The Women's March was supposed to be a very, very broad national. It was in the wake of the election of Trump to the presidency, and Linda Sarsour was one of the co-chairs of the and so Linda Sarsour, of course, has long been an outspoken anti-racist, anti-Zionist organizer, grassroots anti-racist, anti-Zionist, not just a Palestine activist. I mean, she's been anti-Black racism forever too. It's like she grew up, primarily exposed to anti-Black racism and responding to that. But she is also Palestinian. She is also anti-Zionist and has all of that outspoken anti-Zionist, analysis. And she was co-chair. And so it brought to a national discussion. I mean, it was ugly and it was painful and it was extremely detrimental to the well-being and health and sanity of so many of the organizers who are survivors of Zionist feminist violence, if you want, if we can say Zionist feminist in the same as a string. But basically it brought along, it necessitated, it provoked, and for which I am thankful, a national discussion of the irreconcilability of Zionism with feminism. So USSF is, you can't be a Zionist in a progressive space. Women's March is, you can't be a Zionist and a feminist. The two are irreconcilable. So when there was all this talk about how can Linda Sarsour, who's openly anti-Zionist, be at the head of a feminist organization, there was, she is very much of a masked figure, but it occasioned a discussion about the broader concepts of feminism and Zionism. Mariam Barghouti, for example, wrote an excellent essay, No, You Can't Be a Zionist and a Feminist. Emily Shire wrote an op-ed, she's a Zionist, saying, what, is there no room in feminism for Zionism? And the answer was like, no, there is no room in feminism for Zionism. If Zionism being a supremacist state structural violence, system of structural violence, it cannot have room for feminism. And so there was a fragmentation of the so-called feminist national community into those who understand that Zionism is irreconcilable with feminism. And again, a national discussion that was really important. None of these moments are easy. They are extremely painful. They hurt individuals, but I want to look at the silver lining and think, okay, out of the USSF, I don't think any progressive space is going to have Zionists now, or is not going to vet programs that come in, workshops, proposals that come in. And out of that, again, it's like the national discussion now. And as a result of that discussion, we've seen a lot of women's studies programs and gender studies programs. So it from what was a national non-academic discussion, it moved on also into the academic sphere. And I say that as an academic because academia is at the tail end of activism. Academia is at the tail end of progressive thought. I mean, we might want to take credit for it because we publish it in our name, but the work is done at the grassroots.
That's right.
And I think so that work was done there. And then eventually, just last year, women's studies groups acknowledged that Palestine is a feminist issue.
And continue to do so, and it continues to be contentious. But I think, what you're highlighting for us is this discussion earlier, right? How does the structure and the individual, how do this liberal framework, how is it being teased out? Like, you can't be a Zionist feminist, but also the pushback within the Women's March was that you couldn't be a feminist and support Palestinian rights because Palestinians are oppressed by their savage men. I mean, this all very much came out also, and when Rasmiya Odeh becomes one of the signatories, along with Angela Davis and others, for the March 8th women's strike, right? When she is invited to be a signatory and at the helm of this. And then there's an attack against the entire platform because how did you include a Palestinian feminist? When in fact, right, this is the paradigmatic example of what any kind of feminism would look like. So it was pushing on both ends. And I think, like you're highlighting, is that in conflict and in struggle, in and of itself, it's produced many different variations that continue to bear out today. I think for those who might not be familiar with Palestine, but might have some sympathies, it's the same idea and the critique of, women who might identify as women first and feminists, but are voting Trump, right? Or have created, are not, listening to those who are most directly affected, not merely by patriarchy, but patriarchy at the nexus of racism and classism and ableism and colonialism, and how those, compound to create a situation where women who are most marginalized can actually lead. So this brings us to Insight, another legacy of Arab American and Palestinian organizing in North America, and one of the most critical moments of history of intersectional, right? Intersectionality is such a big word now, but again, before we had the language for it, but a key moment of Palestinian intersectional organizing happens in the early 2000s.
Yes.
Right. And this time it's happening in the crucible of a woman of color organization called Insight, Women of Color Against Violence. Can you tell us about the founding of Insight and how it ultimately becomes one of the first feminist organizations to condemn Zionism and endorse BDS in the early 2000s?
Yes. And of course, it's important that they are not primarily, but they are women of color. I mean, so, the analysis of women of color has always been very different from the analysis of privileged white women. Anyway, so Insight formed like so many of the fabulous little movements that are born on the margins of a conference, in the hallways, in the corridors, not in the mainstream, auditorium. So it came out of the 2000 NWSA meeting where, feminist scholars, mostly scholars, at the NWSA 2000 annual meeting were like, this does not represent us, this did not speak to our, and this was in the hallways, as I said, to our experience and all of that, and we want to create a different organization. So Women of Color Against Violence. And so it was founded to create the space for feminist of color analysis that was not there in mainstream, which means hegemonically white spaces of feminist analysis. So and Insight formed, as I said, in the hallways, and then
NWSA, maybe say for folks what that is.
National Women's Studies Association.
Yeah, we hadn't named it. That's all.
All right. So, and then Insight decided that they would put on a conference, and I was not one of the early, I did not join Insight until a few years later. And, as we name legacies, I have to name Nadine Neber, who was one of the early members of Insight, and who's the one who actually brought me into Insight. Nadine represent. Anyway, so then the first conference that Insight put together, they just sent out, we're going to organize a conference to anybody who wants to sign in. And they had no idea how many people would show up. 4,000 people wanted to show up. They had reserved a small space. It was bursting at the seams with 2,000 people who eventually came and 2,000 people who were actually turned away. Sorry, there's only so much we can accommodate. So clearly there was a need there for the grassroots, because eventually it moved very much away from academia, even though its origins were academic, it became more of a grassroots organization. There was a need for that analysis. And one thing about Insight that I love and that I think every single progressive group and organization should have is like, at our retreats, we had retreats every 3 months, like physical in-person 2-3 day retreats. They were exhausting, they were draining, absolutely. It's like we were up at 6 and we went to bed maybe at 2 or 3 a.m. and it was nothing but organizing, thinking, talking, planning, and it happened every 3 months. And as I said, they were draining but necessary. And we planned at each one of those retreats that there would be one teaching by one of the members of the collective, the National Steering Collective, about a topic that all of us should be more familiar with, that person knew well. And so there was a teaching, there were many, many teachings. There were teachings about anti-Black racism within people of color coalitions. There were teachings about Palestine very early on at those retreats. There would be, so there were more than one in order to bring Insight on board. But eventually, Insight understood the importance of Palestine. Insight understood the importance of Palestine as a feminist issue, as a queer issue, as of that. And so when I was by then a member of the National Steering Collective, when the BDS call was issued, because of all of the prior work we had done with all these teachings. And again, I want to give credit to Nadine. I want to give credit to Clarissa Rojas, who was also very much there and did so much of that background work. I mean, I think a feminist analysis of our legacy is an analysis of the background work we do before something finally becomes public. So much of that background work.
Wait, let's pause and say that again. That's a gem, Nada. A feminist analysis of our work would be an excavation of the background work that precedes the public articulation.
Yes, I think that's almost
That's okay. That's a gem. Yeah.
So again, that's why I say I want to give credit to all of the women who came before me. Nadine, certainly, Clarissa represent. Okay. And, so anyway, by the time the BDS call was issued, and there was also the Ford Foundation and the taking away of the money for that conference. I can talk about that too. But anyway, when the BDS...
the punishment. This has not come without great sacrifice.
Yes.
Yeah.
When the BDS call was issued, I said, we need to endorse, and there was no argument. I mean, I didn't have to make the case. The case had been made, and Insight endorsed BDS. So again, because of all of the background work. So if you want me to talk briefly, like the cost of it, right? So the cost of it, and again, I was already on board then. I think it was 2004, if I remember. We had written a grant proposal to the Ford Foundation, and we received, a very large grant proposal, because we were going to put on a conference. 2003, actually, not 4. We had the Ford Foundation. We have the letter. We have the letter in the archives of Insight somewhere. Congratulations, the Ford Foundation approves of your grant, and it was an extremely large amount, like $100,000, which was for general use, and we were going to put on that conference. And at the conferences, we used to, rent the space, rent hotel rooms for everyone who was coming in, and all of that. So we got the grant from the Ford Foundation, and we apparently at the Ford Foundation board meeting, where they were talking about, okay, this is what we did, these are the grants we gave. Someone was there and like, Insight, who's that? What's Insight? And so they Googled Insight, and the first thing that appeared as they were Googling Insight was the Palestine Points of Unity. that was even before the endorsed BDS, the Palestine Points of Unity. To be a member of Insight, you have to understand that Palestine is a feminist issue. And when they saw that, they're like, we cannot fund an organization that supports Palestine, and they withdrew the grant that they had given us. And we found ourselves broke overnight, having already spent the money that we were supposed to be receiving. But you know, that's one of the examples of the cost of Palestinian solidarity. And it, in some ways, it explains why some people shy away from it.
Oh, big time. I mean, this is, you know, people understand that there's punishment, and that's why there's like whispered and hushed solidarity that's not as public. The BLM went through the same thing after issuing their 2016 platform. When support for them was rescinded, events were canceled, places would not, you know, and the BLM had to double down on its solidarity. I mean, I think that these things also speak for themselves of, you know, well, who's progressive if they're willing to shut down women of color and, you know, against violence organizing and anti, you know, folks who are combating anti-Black racism and seeking a better world. Yes. Let me shift us a little bit to continue this track about the legacies. So Insight becomes a great legacy. I mean, this, as you said, the feminist analysis is in the background work. Like, this is the early 2000s doing this work, but there's more. There's women of color delegations to Palestine. Yes. There's queer delegations to Palestine. There's organizing now within the National Women's Solidarity, the National Women's Studies Association. There's now organizing there. They're about to endorse, and they do academic boycott. And so tell us, can you walk us through a little bit about the organizing of those delegations and how it too is creating the work and basically the reference of Palestine is a feminist issue?
Yeah, and it's mostly, I think it's a matter of piercing through or ramming through or shattering the grasp, the hold of the Zionist narrative in this country. I mean, all that what we are doing is actually showing the Palestinian version, which has been censored, silenced, repressed so hard that people can think of themselves as progressive while still holding on to the Zionist narrative. So all of these delegations, all of the background work is basically, you know, erasing, dismantling the Zionist narrative simply by showing the Palestinian one. I mean, the amount of censorship that we encounter to this day is overwhelming. And so much of the work is about pushing through that censorship. So these delegations, you know, like a woman of color delegation, basically it took, I believe it was 12 women of color from the US, primarily activists, but a few artists or independent scholars, to Palestine. And, you know, they included some key scholars, Angela Davis, Barbara Ransby, and so on. And they went to Palestine and they saw for themselves. It's like, okay, I mean, what we are seeing, we recognize as women of color as structural violence against women of color. And so that was one of the delegations, women of color, scholars and activists and artists going to Palestine and seeing firsthand. And upon their return, they issued a statement where they said, you know, Palestine, we endorse Palestinian, the Palestinian struggle, and we endorse, you know, BDS and so on. So that was one. And again, it took, you know, those delegations are not easy to form. You go, you're breaking through so many levels of censorship, of problems put on by the state, you know, of visa, of all of that in order to form a delegation. The other one was the queer delegation, and it was a delegation that was aimed at disrupting pinkwashing. And again, I mean, a lot of the anti-pinkwashing energy came after that delegation, which was showing, you know, the reality of apartheid in Palestine. For example, Dean Spade was part of that delegation, and Dean Spade after that put on he's based in Seattle and an excellent organizer, and we shut
Yeah, wonderful person. Yeah.
We shut down pinkwashing events here in Seattle. He directed the documentary Pinkwashing Exposed, all of that. And he was one of the members who had gone on that queer delegation to Palestine. So, all the work that goes into the delegations is worthwhile because of what comes out of them. And we have more and more groups, progressive groups who who then issue statements, endorse BDS, which is the call for solidarity, basically. The system, Zionist repression, US Zionist repression is so powerful that it takes a lot to break through it, but we are making huge progress. And again, it's all of the work behind all these delegations is worthwhile in a way. I mean, I wish we had to stop. We didn't have to, but it's worthwhile.
Yeah, it becomes worthwhile because, like you're saying, I mean, if you're going to get somebody on a delegation, you have to convince them to come on the delegation, which means that there's all this education work that's happening preceding this moment. Then, the moment of their realization and the complicity, right? By virtue of being in the United States, we are part of the problem and complicit. We are funding this structure. And in our participation in this society, if we're not working against it, we're actually promoting it.
Yes.
So I think, that organizing work, which brings us to the present moment, I think that there's been all of these remarkable strides, right, that we've noted, these legacies that we're certainly continuing. Can you tell us about the most contemporary renewals of Palestinian feminist organizing? The Palestinian Feminist Collective is one that's in the diaspora that you and I are a part of. There's also Talat in Palestine. There's other organizations that, represent very squarely an anti-imperialist queer analysis like Al-Qaws. And I wonder, what are some of the, contemporary, what can we say about these renewals and their significance, as well as the challenges that they're facing internally and externally at this moment?
Okay, so I mean, extremely encouraging, extremely empowering, extremely inspiring. And at the same time, when we think of the current political context, the social context, how sad, right? So, Talat was formed in the aftermath of the murder of Isra Ghraib, who was murdered by her family, by her parents, her father and brothers.
Her uncle, and her brothers,
and it's the context, the phenomenon of femicide, which is actually, I mean, it's sad, but yes, there's a rise in femicide in Palestine now, and we need to understand the context of that rise in femicide, which is basically the extreme oppression that all of Palestinian society is going through. And when we speak of macro environment and micro environment, of course, the macro environment of violence trickles into the micro environment, and anyone who has power then uses that power to gain control, to gain self-respect, to gain self-esteem, personal, by actually engaging in violence against someone who is vulnerable, basically. So we're seeing that oppression, that increased rates of femicide within Palestinian society. The more repressive Israeli society becomes. I mean, I have to explain why femicide is on the rise. It's outrageous. It's of course self-destructive, but it is, when we speak of legacies, we have to also acknowledge the legacy of Black scholars, Black feminists before us. And Black feminists have explained that the rates of domestic violence within Black households is also because the Black man, the only control that a Black man has in a society that is so deeply racist is a control of the Black woman, right? When you have no access to power because of racism, then you exercise power within. And it's that same kind of analysis. It's very easy to think of that in Palestine. When you have no power to end a huge, overpowering system of oppression, then the only sense of control you have is by controlling those that you can, and that would be the women. So that's where the femicide comes in. But as a result of the rates of the increasing rates of femicide, Palestinian women, Talat and the Palestinian Feminist Collective, are coming up with this analysis that's actually feminist thinking, feminist praxis of, there's no, the slogan, no free land, no free homeland without free women, and I would add without free queers. And by feminist praxis, I mean that we are deliberately and intentionally creating the alternative, not just dismantling an oppressive system, but creating the alternative that is going to come in once the oppressive system is dismantled. So there's an understanding, we have this understanding just from looking around us, that the liberation of women does not come after national liberation. I mean, it's absurd to even think that the liberation of women can come after national liberation. It's part and parcel of liberation, of social liberation, of political liberation, of national liberation. It's not something that comes after. Nothing comes after liberation. Liberation is indivisible. Justice is indivisible. And so as we are seeking to dismantle oppressive systems, Zionism is patriarchal. Zionism is gendered violence. We have to dismantle that in all of its manifestations. And so that's where the analysis of groups like Talat and PFC comes in. It's a dismantling of all oppressive systems, including gendered violence. And it's also a holistic approach towards a liberated society that, we can't have a liberated society that preserves some of the social structures that are oppressive. It's just, it's not going to work that way. So, and because of our awareness of that, we are already building the complete alternative, which is one where there's liberation, there's sisterhood, there's community, there's well-being, at home as well as in the broader society, because you can't have one without the other. I mean, what we are experiencing in Palestine is that you can't have one without the other. There's no point in getting rid of the macro environment of oppression, of violence, of discrimination, of structure, without also at the same time doing the micro environment. And for me, the new I don't want to say it's a very new direction, because I think we've had that understanding all along, but it's the new impetus, if you want, the dominant aspect of the analysis, I think, of Talat and PFC is a focus on the revolution starts at home.
Absolutely. I think you're right. Like this, it's not merely the indivisibility, which we've understood, but also the idea that this isn't going to take us longer, right? So this notion of, if we include gender liberation, it's going to take national liberation longer. In fact, what it does is it speeds it up.
Absolutely.
Right? It makes it more robust and strong and holistic, because it also creates the alternative, right? Because we're not just seeking to destroy and dismantle, we're building. And so here's the building
Yes.
that's being done. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, Nada. Nada Elia, Professor Nada Elia, activist, author, inspirational speaker, amazing friend. Thank you so much for joining us on Status Hour and providing us with this rich history. We look forward to reading your forthcoming essays and absolutely your forthcoming book, and continuing our conversations with you.
Thank you.